introduce the next speaker for our forum today. Yang berbahagia Datin Seri Sunita Rajakumar. She's an independent professional director and a strong advocate of the importance of governance in general and risk management in particular. She founded Climate Governance Malaysia, which is the country chapter of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Initiative. Is a fellow of the Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia, promotes gender diversity on boards with the 30% Club, a member of the Global Advisory Board of Nottingham University School of Business, and the advisory panel of the UN Global Compact Malaysia's Sustainability Center of Excellence. And is a workstream lead for government policy for the CEO Action Network, an industry-led initiative to increase sustainability and climate resilience. Datin Seri Sunita is chair of Caring Pharmacy and independent directors of Bursa-listed Dutch Lady Milk Industries, MCIS Insurance, a member of the Sunland Group, and Zurich General Insurance and trustee of 5 charitable foundations. Datin Seri Sunita will be presenting on climate change issues affecting SMEs. So over to you, Datin Seri.
Thank you so much, Zaidi. And thank you so much to MICG, especially Roshni, for always supporting Climate Governance Malaysia. Really appreciate it. And what a fascinating presentation that was earlier, isn't it, from Dr. Malin? I found that so interesting. But for today, we want to talk about climate governance. And the quote that Zahidi shared just now is that investing in climate resilience is a zero regret investment decision. And this is something that actually Tengku Taufik of Petronas, the President Group CEO, had said to me during one of our conversations. And I found it really fascinating because he really hit the nail on the head. If businesses are to consider how they can increase their climate resilience, this is not going to be an investment decision that you regret. And why is this such a major issue? Because scientists, economists, even central bankers have for years been saying that we are on the verge of an abyss. The last 3 years were the 3 warmest years on record. We are warming up the planet through our human activities, and it is very likely this is going to be irreversible. And this is going to change the world economy as well. Swiss Re, the reinsurer, has estimated that countries in this region would see economic growth of 20% below what they could otherwise expect in less than 3 decades from now. And in the event of a 3.2 degree increase in temperature, which is a severe case for temperature gains, levels of wealth would be halved. So this is something very, very significant. Because for many years now, and in this chart it shows from 1851, the world's temperature has been slowly, steadily increasing. And this looks like it's going to be an irreversible trend, very, very difficult to reverse. 2020 in the Arctic also was extremely warm. The concentration of major greenhouse gases has been increasing on an almost exponential scale. What does this mean? Well, when temperatures increase from, let's say, half degree Celsius, 1.52 degrees, the risk of certain, what are essentially climate risk, but also have a financial effect, increases. Ecosystems are threatened. There's going to be adverse, extreme weather events, corals, Arctic region, coastal flooding, river flooding, crop yields are going to drop, and heat-related morbidity, mortality because of heat stroke events, for example. And so the scientists have been saying for years now that we are facing a future of mass extinction, declining health, and upheavals caused by climate disruption. And because the Earth's ecosystem is so complex, it is likely that the planet is in a much worse state than most people, even the scientists, understand, that most people do not recognize how vast the problem is. So the Paris Agreement was signed in December 2015. But from 2016 onwards, up to what our estimates are for 2030, it looks as though emissions are still increasing. And what we need for emissions consistent with 1.5 degree of warming is actually almost half that. And we need to keep pathways open, and this means by mid-century, you need to have net zero emissions throughout all economic sectors. And so it is very crucial that national policies are aligned, because when you set a high-level target, countries can then ensure that the sectoral level targets and policies will add up to the necessary actions, because when numbers are aligned, that means behaviors are going to be aligned. And so quantifying national targets, which for the Paris Agreement is called a nationally determined contribution. Each country has to state what their NDC is towards this problem. And what is the challenge that we're facing? That out of 196 countries, 139 do not have targets for the entire economy. Another 40 has insufficient data to determine consistency, and only 17 have implemented policies and laws that are at least as ambitious as their stated NDC target. So we have a huge gap that we're facing right now. Put another way, the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to bend this curve. So bend the curve is a concept that we're familiar with in the pandemic. And here with greenhouse gas emissions, or in this case, CO2 emissions, if we need to mitigate, the longer we take, the steeper is going to be needed. The steeper mitigation curve is going to be needed. And as a matter of fact, we're looking at a scenario now, a very realistic scenario, that we might even need very large negative emissions where we start sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And in Malaysia, Think City has done some very good work about rising temperatures. Their temperature increases of already 6.7 degrees Celsius. The cities are heating up. I'll give you two examples. On the left-hand side, in KL City Centre, an increase of 1.64 degree, and this is highest recorded temperature, not average for the year. And in KL, most probably, it's due to a significant increase in the built environment, which leads to a rise of surface temperature. And on the right-hand side in Ipoh, an increase of 6.75 degrees between the highest temperature in 1998 and the highest temperature in 2019. But green areas around Ipoh are some of the cooler areas in the city. So this indicates the sort of ecological environment that we need for human well-being. And if the world is warming, what's happening is that a lot of the ice caps are going to be melting. Or more specifically, significant huge ice sheets are on the brink of major tipping points. That means even if global heating is halted, it is still going to continue melting. And if all of this ice sheet in Greenland that we're talking about here melts, this could raise global sea levels by 7 meters. And scientists are unsure if we have already passed the tipping point. This just came out yesterday that the world's largest iceberg has just broken off the southern Antarctic ice shelf. This is not, apparently it is not due to anthropogenic activities, not due to warming, it's natural evolution, but still it's a sobering event that indicates how little is within our control if we carry on the current trajectory. So what's happening is that as sea level rises, this part of the world is going to be most affected. Not just because we are in the equatorial region, but because many people live by the coast in this part of the world. And so a relative sea level rise is going to have a much more sudden and severe impact for this part of the world, Southeast Asia. This is another assessment of major cities, and the size of the bubble indicates the size of the population. So as you can see, in terms of climate change risk, many Asian cities are going to be affected. As a matter of fact, if businesses are unable to account for the full spectrum of threats and impacts that are facing them, They're going to have some very difficult conversations with investors and regulators who are increasingly concerned about these broader ESG risks. Even if you have started implementing disclosure recommendations. And it's even more crucial because it is a primary choke point where we live, is a primary choke point for Asia, accounting for 25% of all traded goods and a third of oil that's transported through sea. And in Malaysia, as you know, we are a trading nation. Exports represent 70% of our GDP. So we are extremely vulnerable to the top financial risks arising from climate risks. Put another way, the World Economic Forum runs a global risk report every January. And this year, environmental risks were one of the highest in terms of impact and in terms of likelihood. Just environmental risks alone, as you can see, most of them are in the top right-hand quadrant. One of the biggest risks is failure to take adequate climate action. And of course, there's going to be a crisis of natural resources, biodiversity loss, and damage to the environment that we are causing, extreme weather events, and geophysical disasters. So because there's been so much attention focused on this major financial risk, there's a lot of data available. And it is very clear that this part of the world is not really paying attention to bending this carbon emissions curve. As a matter of fact, in all of Asia, only the three Asian giants, China, Japan, Korea, have set net carbon zero targets for 2050 and 2060. So Asia really needs to think about how we can reduce our CO2 emissions. Numbers are also available at a company level as to who are the largest emitters. And this is one example where the top 20 carbon majors are responsible for 35% of total emissions for the last few decades. There is also data for banks who are supporting emissions. So the thinking is that as an allocator of capital, you can either be an enabler for polluting industries, or you can be a powerful lever to push companies to cut emissions and to prepare for a low carbon future. Because the real economy transition that is required is going to need a huge amount of capital to decarbonize the economy and to enhance our resilience, which public sector alone cannot provide, but can facilitate. So these are the sort of numbers that will be available if there are businesses that are continuing to fund and fuel climate chaos. And as you can imagine, it's just a very small step now that the causality has been established, that if this is your business, if this is the outcome of your business, or if you are funding such businesses, then the conversation will turn to liability. For the damage and destruction that's going to arise, how liable are you to remedy this destruction? And with these numbers, what's also going to happen is that your sovereign ratings are going to change. And there's actually been calculation done as to how many notches your sovereign rating is going to reduce by. And countries like Malaysia could see up to 6 notches of downgrades. And these are the estimates that are coming up now. So this level of data is already available. And as a country, we are not just dependent as an exporting nation, but our food sufficiency as well. We are not self-sufficient as a nation. And for those areas where we have 1 to 2 months of reserves, such as poultry, we are extremely dependent on imported animal feed. Neighboring countries, of course, are worried about this. Our neighboring country down south are already seeing a lot more intense rainfall, one of the highest in the last 40 years. They have also done calculations as to what they need to do and how they're going to be adversely impacted. Specifically, they have already calculated that if the world sees sea level rise of 1 meter, Singapore will face 30% greater sea level rise, 1.3 meters sea level rise. And they do recognize that Southeast Asia is especially vulnerable to sea level rise. Our neighboring countries such as Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, significant parts of the country are going to be below water level. And this is already having an effect, for example, in Vietnam, where increasing flooding is bringing sea levels in and increasing the salinity of this traditionally freshwater delta, which means it has to pivot from traditional agricultural crops such as rice to other forms of farming, such as prawn farming. So to recap, increase in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere on the far left-hand side is going to lead to additional greenhouse gas effect and increased radiative forcing, which is the basis for the concentration pathways that international organizations are using for scenarios. And this means warmer land, ocean, and atmosphere, or any parts of the water body which is in ice, such as snow or huge masses of ice, are going to be melting. This is going to result in increased surface temperature. The ocean is going to be warming and releasing more CO2. Glacial mass is going to be moving. Sea ice is going to be reducing, and sea levels are going to be rising. And this is going to have a huge effect on global circulation patterns, which is going to result in high impact events from heat waves to droughts to tropical cyclones. And this is going to affect key SDG goals that we have all been working towards. So for a company, it's important for a company to realize that the outside influences, for example, public opinion, and especially in this part of the world, climate solutions are viewed as a fast path to improve your brand performance, to be part of the solution rather than be part of the problem. And the customers and suppliers are influential stakeholders too. And from within the organization, you could have cost savings by making this zero regret investment decision. You need to endorse this at a very high level. Top-down leadership endorsement is needed. And you need to have long-term planning because there's no silver bullet. There's no clear-cut path to pivoting from brown to green. We need to look at multiple scenarios. We need to assess different technologies that are available. So these are the pressures from inside the organization when you're considering the effectiveness of your climate strategies. So understandably, with the disclosure of more information that is needed and with the dynamic materiality that is arising, the Accounting Standards Board is getting into the picture right now. And they are saying, look, if this is material, this needs to be disclosed. And for that, companies need to have their numbers ready. What is their carbon footprint? What is their energy efficiency? Their waste, water management, for example. Elsewhere, carbon has been priced in over 60 jurisdictions around the world. There's some form of carbon pricing already implemented, including in Singapore. And in Europe, the EU emissions trading scheme, the carbon price is already at 40 euros per metric ton of CO2. And this is very sobering because I don't think there's a lot of businesses in Malaysia that would be able to absorb this sort of cash outflow or expense in their P&L. And this has been increasing as well. The value of the global carbon market hit a 5-fold increase from 2 years ago. And the EU's emissions trading scheme, of course, accounts for nearly 9/10 of that, but there's an increasingly important conversation about voluntary carbon markets, which is taking place right now. So this could come sooner rather than later. From Malaysia's perspective, I want us all to remember it is very likely everyone on this call or everyone who is older than 18 years old was living at a time when we were net zero emissions. So this is a chart of the emissions from different sectors, from our energy sector, waste, indirect nitrogen oxide from deposition of nitrogen, and what we're removing from our trees. And the red line is the net emissions. So if you see, as of 2004, we were actually net zero. So this is very recent, and it's extremely possible that we can reverse our trend at least very soon. So this is what Climate Governance Malaysia does. In January 2019, the World Economic Forum issued a set of guiding principles on how boards could set up effective climate governance. And there are key categories that we walk the boards through, and it's very user-friendly. It's in the form of questions that you ask your board. So for example, principle 1 is climate accountability, just reminding the board that the board is ultimately accountable for the long-term stewardship of the company. And failure to manage risks, especially material dynamic risks, may constitute a breach of directors' duties. And so there are guiding questions to lead the board through their preparedness, their readiness. And in Singapore, we've recently had a conference on directors' duties. In Malaysia, we're going to have ours in July. That's coming up soon, so please sign up for that. But in Singapore, this webinar stated very clearly, directors need to take climate change seriously or risk personal liability, because the risks are now undeniable. And so directors are expected to factor these risks in and to consider them, and as part of their duties to act in the best interest of the company, and failure to do so could result in legal action, not just for the company, but for themselves personally. The second principle is command of the subject matter. To what extent does the entire board have awareness and understanding? Has an assessment of climate competence gaps taken place? Who is responsible for this conversation? And is there succession planning to ensure that climate awareness does not stop if an important individual leaves the organization? The third principle is board structure, how to ensure that it's effectively integrated into board committee structures, and for example, audit, risk, nomination, remuneration. This is not just the responsibility of the CSO or one person in the organization. It's like financial literacy. Climate literacy needs to be mainstreamed so that all critical decisions take this key financial risk into consideration. So materiality. Has the company embedded effective materiality assessment processes in relation to risks and opportunities? What about strategic and organizational integration throughout the organization? Incentives, because you align incentives with behavior. So we need to ensure that executive incentives are not aligned to just short-term profitability, but they promote the long-term prosperity of the company. And so this might include climate KPIs, targets or goals, which the board needs to incorporate into management's incentive schemes. And of course, reporting and disclosure, because this is how allocators of capital, such as investors, bankers, and insurers, are going to make decisions about your cost of funding. And professional accountants, the role of the CFO, they're becoming a very powerful force for sustainability, because you need to manage and report on all of an organization's resources. We need a robust, transparent accounting system before we can have clarity on action. It is crucial because you cannot have an agreement without assessment, and you cannot have assessment without proper measurement and disclosure. And this is where professional accountants at the highest level need to develop high quality information and insights. They are essential to this conversation. Because there are going to be many unintended consequences, and I'd like to remind everyone that it's each of our personal responsibilities to be able to make more informed decisions, not just about business decisions, but about our individual lifestyle choices, because it's going to have a wider range of impact than we can anticipate. Day before yesterday, the International Energy Agency issued a net zero roadmap for the global energy sector. And they are alarmed because despite all the pledges and efforts that the governments have taken to tackle the causes of global warming, CO2 emissions have actually increased substantially. And global commitments are growing, but they still fall well short of what is needed to limit the rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees and avert the worst effects of climate change. So we can achieve net zero emissions by 2050, but they say this is going to be nothing short than a complete transformation of the global energy system. What does this mean in plain English? Well, some of the examples are that we need to immediately stop approving coal-fired power plants and oil and gas fields. We need to phase out gasoline-powered vehicles. And it's very significant because the IEA is not an environmental group. It is an international organization that advises on energy policy. So their recommendations are very detailed. We need to stop approving new coal plants. We need to stop the development of new oil and gas fields. We need to ban the sale of oil and gas furnaces to heat buildings. We need to increase electrification, even in terms of transport and zero out emissions. This is one of the charts that they have in their report. Please take a look at it because it will give you a good idea of the huge extent of the pivot that's going to be needed. And no sector in the economy is going to be untouched by this. And as a matter of fact, if carbon is priced, then every business is going to have to step up and contribute towards the cost of this pollution. So there's a lot of resources available on our website. We try to record as many of our webinars as possible. There's also a lot of documents that are available. So take a look, be part of this conversation, because remember the tipping point is going to come soon. And if you're not early enough to transform your business, no one is going to buy your goods, no one is going to invest in you, no one will want to work for you. So just remember, this is a zero regret investment decision that you will be making. Zahid, are there any questions for me, Zaidi?
Okay, question. Hold on, yeah.
Is there a need to come up?
There's one question here. Let me text. I can't copy it. The question is, in your opinion, is there a need to come up with best practice climate governance, something that is similar to MACC?
MCCG.
MCCG, yes, in Malaysia.
Yeah. So the MCCG recently published also refers to the need for managing this climate risk. So just to remind that what I spoke about earlier, the principles of climate governance, that is actually available on our website. If you go to the resources section, that will be the first document that you see. And there are many other documents that are already available. So there's a whole spectrum of action that can be taken. What Climate Governance Malaysia tries to promote is actually principles of climate governance, which is at a board level. How do you manage these risks, especially as independent directors who only turn up a few times a year at a board level to the company? But from the business point of view, the pathway is very clear. Start off by measuring your carbon footprint, your wastewater energy efficiency. And then once you've started that, you might want to consider increased disclosure. And this is where people tend to look to the TCFD and SASB standards as being the gold standards most commonly used right now, the most helpful that you will find. And once you've started measuring, reporting, and disclosing, then you might want to be part of this race to zero. Set your own climate ambition. So state that we are going to be net zero by 2030, and maybe by 2040, we want to be negative emissions. So our business is actually sucking in more carbon than we are emitting. Technology companies such as Microsoft, Google have already made these sort of declarations. And then once you have set that, make sure also that it's a science-based target. Go to the Science-Based Target website. There are different ways in which, by sector, by industry, they will guide you as to how you can set a science-based target that ensures that you reach net zero in the most efficient way. And you can also share in other best practices in your industry or similar industries. And once you have done that, I like to think that at the far end of the spectrum, you're also looking at embedding sustainability into the DNA of your business. And this is where being part of the circular economy is an important objective that you want to get to. Because a lot of what we do is very extractive to the environment. We take freely from the environment, and then once we are done, the product can no longer very often be decomposed back into the environment. So if you start planning for circularity in your business, then you're much more mindful about the raw materials that you use.
Okay, another question from Susie Wong. She asked about, is there a control over the cutting of trees or destroying the green lungs for property development?
Yeah, so obviously this is a very complex question, because even when forests are designated as reserves and gazetted as reserves, sometimes that gazetting can be reversed as well. So CGM and another organization called the CEO Action Network are actually working as a group of 43 CEOs and directors, and CGM as a group of independent directors, are working on a series of roundtable discussions to come up with a set of policy recommendations that we could make respectfully to the government for them to consider if they were to decide to increase climate ambition. And so this is something where it comes to protecting our carbon sinks. It's very complex. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by giving you a simple yes or no answer, because there are a lot of stakeholders at play. Land is a state matter. There are different actors that need to be persuaded, that need to be primed to participate in this conversation. And there's also a lot of interested parties, foreigners, who are interested in carbon offsetting. So I would not say that this is a straightforward question, but there's a lot of efforts going into this space right now.
Okay, another question. How does the role play by government to increase awareness of climate governance to SME especially? Because not all SMEs are actively participated in webinar, etc. Any recognition to award best observed climate governance entities?
Yeah. So, you know, we've been having this conversation with MICG. MICG this year resolved to target raising awareness of governance in general with the SME community, which I think is a terrific job. That is, as has been pointed out by this question, is actually a wide open space. And also SSM. SSM also are in conversations with us to have a series of talks. Actually, SMEs need to do this because it relates to the survival of their business. I'm not sure if SMEs should be doing this because they want to win an award, because it is a question of survival. It's a question of liability. It's a question of new business opportunities coming up that you might want to pay attention to.
And another question, what about customer proposition? How companies can ensure their supply chains adopt the same goal to achieve net zero carbon emission?
So of course it's easier if you're a very large player. This is something that Petronas can do, for example, with their service providers. And even then, it's difficult to just push this down someone's throats because they need to understand, they need to be aware. And it is, you know, the way we look at it, it is a carrot and stick approach. You know, there is a stick because you're part of the problem if you're not reducing your emissions. You might be penalized when carbon is eventually priced. Your cost of funding from banks is going to be higher because Bank Negara has already been working on this for the past few years, ensuring that their principle-based taxonomy guides financial institutions as in their lending practices. So if you look at the taxonomy that just came out a few days ago, it is very clear there's going to be different categories of businesses that will qualify for lending. And if you're in a category that doesn't seem to understand that this is a problem, then you might not be able to get financing facilities, or you might have a higher cost of funding. So I think there are a lot of incentives for SMEs to make this pivot, and they need to reach out, not just wait for their customers to be guiding them.
Another statement asking for your view. Apart from various government or regulatory enforcement strategies, we need ourselves to become net zero sensitive. And then self-governance can drive initiative and take up of technologies that are more environmental friendly. What is your view on that?
I'll give you an example. Oil and gas companies are saying that, I showed the chart earlier of how much the carbon majors have contributed to cumulative greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere to date. And they are the biggest culprits. And you know what they are saying? They are saying that their upstream oil and gas activities only account for 10, maybe 15% of the total carbon footprint. The rest is people like you and I and everyone on this call with all of our lifestyle decisions. And that's what this question is about. The food that you eat, how electrified your lifestyle is, how you're taking your overseas holidays, of course, pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID. So basically, all of your lifestyle decisions trigger the beginning of this supply chain, that people can only sell products and services if there's someone on the other end buying it. And that comes down to an individual's purchasing choice. So I absolutely agree that it comes to being more mindful about your lifestyle choices, about your work choices, and also educating people that you work with and that you live with.
Another straightforward question. Does climate governance in any way is linked to ISO 14001?
I'm not familiar with ISO 14001, so I'd like to pass on that question.
Okay. All right. I noticed that, the last one, I noticed that quite a number of institutional investors in Malaysia, such as EPF, have been using ESG. That's include climate governance approach nowadays. Do institutional investors are doing a good job in championing climate governance at this point of time?
So earlier in the year, we actually had a webinar with Institutional Investors Council. They have been engaging with us. They are aware. The institutional investors, because it is their responsibility as stewards, tend to be much more aware than the ordinary individual retail investor, for example. And they have been looking into this. We've been having conversations with them many times. EPF, thankfully, is leading the charge, and I think it's extremely ambitious of them. The former CEO especially was a huge champion of sustainability measures and extremely knowledgeable about this. Could they be doing more? Well, during one of our webinars earlier this year, we had invited the head of stewardship for Asia Pacific for BlackRock, and they were categoric. They were saying that if companies aren't giving them the information that they require in their reporting and disclosure, they want to vote against the directors, the reappointment of directors. In some other parts of the world, they want a say on their climate strategy. That means they want even your climate strategy to be tabled to shareholders for an advisory vote. So this is how the conversation internationally has evolved. And I think Malaysian investors really need to step up because, as I pointed out, this part of the world is especially vulnerable to climate risks.
Okay. Perhaps we can take one more last question. Are schools or food sellers required to observe climate governance? Because I have seen usage of polystyrene packaging, for example, widely used.
So the Ministry of Environment and Water have been talking about this for a very long time. They strongly advocate all of society approach. That means they don't just want to mandate policies that say zero single-use plastic, for example. They actually have been engaging with plastics manufacturers, large and small manufacturers, and they're also talking about recycling waste. Did you know that it's actually mandatory right now for us to sort our waste at source, although it doesn't seem to be happening on a wide scale? So yes, there's a lot of attention that CASA is paying to this, and hopefully we'll reach a situation where we will not have these sort of instances that is widely happening.
Okay, thank you, Datin Sri, for your time and for your session. It
Thank you
was
so
very
much.
wonderful and very insightful knowledge about climate change and how does that affecting SMEs. Thank you,
Thank you
Datin.
for having